Libraries have always been an open space of equal access, and where librarians are the custodians of knowledge past and the incubators of knowledge future. And in fact, it's one of the places where you can find a point of view and its counter point of view, and read about both. And that function is going to become more important, not less important, in the period in which we are living, with the enormous explosion of information that we are witnessing. Because sometimes I've given as an example, I said, we needed to drink, and when we were in developing countries, when I was young, we didn't have access to the books and access to many things. So it was like somebody who's parched for water, and you put a few drops on their tongue. That's not enough really to drink. But then if you open a fire hose on me, I also cannot drink. I can't drink out of a fire hose. So the librarians, therefore, are going to have to curate information, to organize information. And specifically in the period where we are witnessing an enormous growth in social media, which has enormous amounts of conspiracy theories and all sorts of wrong information, it would be important to be able to go to library websites and find the trusted information, or at least portals that will lead you to academies, to research institutions, etc., that will give you the right kind of information. But what about the building itself? Do we still need bricks and mortar libraries? The answer is yes. I think we do. But it will have to be different kinds of libraries than those that we had before. By that I mean we need a space where kids can really be creative and have some rock music and some pizza cartons on the floor and movie posters on the wall and talk to each other and do their thing. Secondly, you need another kind of space where more and more young people, especially those who are studying in universities and so on, do some group work. And then we have our conventional client that we got used to in the libraries, in the reading rooms of libraries, where the librarian would go shh to everybody and so on. And that is somebody who's doing deep research and wants a cubicle and access to information and work there. But we also need a space where the library can be the interaction between the library, specialized space, whether it's in a university or not, and the community, and where we can have special exhibitions that are backed up by the knowledge of the library and the librarians. And these four types of spaces can be done. So when people say, but where are we going to get the space to do that? The answer is simple, because we're going to remove many of the stacks that are presently taking up a lot of space. We'll put them into off-site storage. We'll have digital copies of everything. And if somebody wants specifically to see the published version, well, you can send for it on the off-site storage and get it back within a day. Is that a problem? Not at all. It is wonderful, because for the first time we have a librarian's dream that I can make access to knowledge available to a remote village, and to have also much greater access. So for example, in the Library of Alexandria, I had 1,100 periodicals published. And these require, of course, that you enter them into the catalog, that you bind them year by year, and put them in storage and so on. On the other hand, I had 73,000 periodicals that are digital, and that would be accessible by computer. And we had 3,000 computers in the building, so that visitors could access almost anything they wanted right away. So we are in a transitional period, and I think that period is very exciting, because the new technologies are making available enormous amounts of information, and our ability also to extract more information from that, like, for example, overlaying maps, historical maps of different periods of the same item that we can do now, we couldn't do before, etc., etc. They will be defending freedom of speech, freedom of expression, and the availability and access to past achievements. How can a library function to the expectations that libraries should be functioning in a place where there is censorship? Everybody wants to censor particular views that they disagree with, but libraries are a very special place. They are a place which is truly a space of freedom. So from my own experience, when I started the Library of Alexandria, I had Western newspaper people and reporters asking me, how can you have a library like the Library of Alexandria when there is censorship? I said, I have no censorship here. And they said, well, at that time, there's a book called The Satanic Verses of Salman Rushdie, which, as you probably know, caused an enormous uproar at a particular point in time. And they said, could you have such a book here? And my answer was simple. Not only can I do. Look it up. It's in the catalog, and you can actually order it from the desk of the librarian, and you can get it here. And so they were satisfied. But then immediately I got a huge series of attacks from Islamists in Egypt at the time, and on television. And I went on television and I defended it. And I said, there's a difference between publishing and circulating a book and having it in the library. So you disagree with this book? I said, of course I disagree with this book. It's an offensive book, and so on and so on. I said, fine. Would you like to write a rebuttal to Mr. Rushdie? And he said, of course I would. I said, fine. And where would you find a copy of Mr. Rushdie's book in order to write your rebuttal? You come to me. You come to the library. And when you publish your rebuttal, I will also put it on my shelves. I will have it on my shelves. And that's the function of a library. It's the natural place where you will find one point of view and the counterpoint of view. It's a place which is trying to create a space, believing, as I do, and I think as most librarians do, that in the marketplace of ideas, ultimately the truth will out and the better work will survive. I would point out, for example, that the Vatican, which for years used to even burn people at the stake for reading the works of certain people, every one of those banned works exists in a copy at the Vatican Library. Now, what is happening is that technology is coming to the rescue. Practically every child has access at his fingertips or her fingertips to an enormous amount of information through the internet. And in addition to that, we've had enormous work that was done by Google Books, for example, or the Hathi Trust. Millions and millions, tens of millions of books have been digitized and are now available to download or to read. And you can do it on handheld devices, from telephones to iPads or computers. And I think that this is going to make the notion of censorship in the old-fashioned way really obsolete. It is true that certain countries are devising complex systems to control the information available to their citizens, either through television or through the internet. There is in China, for example, a level of control that is different than what is available in the West. And that level of freedom, which is now available to all the countries of the world, pretty much, comes with its own risks. And this is that people spread information around to each other. I have read such and such a thing on the internet, even though it may be totally false. And that, I think, is part of the responsibility where trusted sources, and I put up front in that, portals that will be designed by libraries, portals meaning that through that you can access a whole variety of websites that are dealing with that topic, but that are trusted websites in terms of the quality of their information. And I think that this is a big step forward for the world and for the coming generation. I argued and published material on the fact that if we want to talk about sustainable development, we should talk about sustainable development in terms of things that are economically sustainable and that are physically sustainable. And then when you come to socially and humanly sustainable. So I proposed, in fact, a notion of capital, so that you want to protect the produced assets or man-made capital. That's what economists normally do. But we need to look what the environmentalists look at, which is natural capital. And there I don't mean just rare metals and oil and so on. I mean the environmental services, the value of biodiversity. And we did a lot of calculations to see what the intrinsic value of these things are. And then you come to the third part of that, which is the human and social part. And there you find suddenly that you have two bits. There is human capital, and that is education, health, and nutrition. And that's embedded in the individual. So when I migrate from my country to another country, I take my human capital with me. On the other hand, there is social capital, and that is the glue that holds a society together, the ability of people to function with each other through a shared perception of a common culture. And that common culture creates a space for trust, national trust, for establishing institutions of trust, for being able to legislate, for being able to interact between people. That common culture becomes essential for people not to fall into warring factions. So that if social capital falls apart, you have countries that go into civil war. At the World Bank, I posed the problem in a way that forced everybody to look at it. And that was by asking the question, saying, in a country which doesn't have enough money for anything, I mean, you need money for agriculture, money for electricity, money for water and sanitation, money for housing, money for education, money for health, etc., etc. How much should that country spend on maintaining its cultural heritage? So the bank would have said normally, and they used to say until I got around into these arguments, they would say, well, tourists, it brings in tourists. And I said, no, if you do a cost-benefit analysis and the only benefit stream comes from tourists, it leads you to three totally false conclusions. Number one, that any heritage that a bunch of foreigners are not interested to come and spend money looking at is not worth protecting. Clearly wrong. Number two, that you would want to maximize that and therefore maximize the number of tourists who come, even if they denature what they are looking at, like the character of an old Medina, or if you think of it, the wilderness in one of the national parks. You don't want to be in bumper and bumper traffic. You want to go and interact with nature and so on. So you don't want to maximize the number of visitors. And thirdly, that that is the logic, and if, for example, a country like Morocco could say that on a lump sum investment, building a casino on the beach would bring more tourist dollars than maintaining the beautiful historic city of Fez, for example, then they should do the casino. And these three conclusions are wrong. And therefore, you cannot limit the benefit stream of protecting your cultural heritage to the idea of tourism. Tourism may be one of the contributing aspects into the benefit stream, but certainly it cannot be the entire thing. We frequently talk about that the building block of the international system is the nation state. And we say that in the treaties of Westphalia in 1648, the modern state was created, the nation state. Actually, the treaties of Westphalia recognized that there would be a boundary with a population and the government. The government could exercise its will within that boundary and was therefore able to enter into agreements with other such governments and so on. That is the sovereign state. it is not necessarily the nation. Now, the nation, if you talk about the Arab nation, for example, there are 22 countries that are members of the Arab League. If you talk about the German nation that shares a legacy of a language, a common heritage, a common narrative of its past history, you would have parts of Switzerland, Germany, and parts of Austria, and so on, all included. But we're talking, inherited the sovereign state. But sovereign states very seldom were an exact match for nation states. But the sovereign governments started to say there is a national culture, which they influenced by a national anthem, a national language, a national historical narrative in the schools, etc., etc. And in so doing, they immediately created the problem of minorities. Because there's hardly ever 100% purity in that, and those who tried later on with ethnic cleansing or religious cleansing or whatever have thankfully been defeated. So I would say that number one, coming from that background, is to think of culture as an ability to bring about a great diversity. And the ministers of culture are responsible to protect the different pieces of that diversity, recognize that diversity, and that it manifests itself in many, many things, from historical legacies to music to dance to cooking to dress to whatever. So there's a lot of manifestations there, and they should all be protected, and to teach the country that our culture is a culture that finds richness in diversity rather than divisiveness and ability to attack the other, which is usually the minorities. Secondly, I would say that they have a responsibility and a huge task it is to maintain the past. A country like Egypt has an enormous legacy of buildings, materials, artifacts, manuscripts, etc., that need protection. And you need to fund that protection, and you need to fund that maintenance aspect. Thirdly is, how do we link that with education? And that's extremely important, because the younger generation that's coming up right now has to value that diversity, appreciate it, and at the same time value the legacies that are common to the whole country. And that is a task that the Minister of Culture is usually the person who's upfront on dealing with that. Finally, there is the argument of tourism, but that's limited as in terms of its application that culture ministers can and should use. And we can help them with these kinds of things, but more importantly, I think, it is to feel that we have a responsibility for the legacy of the past, to present it in a way not just that is attractive and accessible to the whole world, but also, in fact, to the next generation. We are here to pass it on to the next generation.